Sometimes life breaks a man down so far that even his own shadow seems like a stranger walking beside him. Sometimes the very folks who should understand turn their backs when you need them most. Boone Keller was once the finest horse trainer from Kansas clear to California, but years of poor choices left him looking like a saddle tramp. When he rode into the Silver Basin horse trading post to buy back Jubilee, the mare he'd raised from a foal and lost in a bitter divorce, the well-dressed traders told him to move along based on his appearance alone. But this weathered cowboy had been saving every dollar for years, waiting for this moment. What happened next would shock everyone at that trading post. But just how far would Boone go to reclaim the one thing he'd ever done right? Before we ride back into this tale, tell us where you're listening from, and if this story moves you. Make sure you come back tomorrow because I've saved something extra special for you. The first thing you'd notice about Boone Keller's cabin wasn't the gaps between the logs that let in winter wind, or the tin roof that drummed like thunder when the rains came. It wasn't even the way the whole structure seemed to lean slightly southward, as if bracing against the constant prairie winds that swept down from the Rockies. No, the first thing that caught your eye was the careful way he'd positioned a single wooden chair on the small porch, angled just so to catch the morning light filtering through the cottonwoods along Willow Creek. Boone sat in that chair now, nursing his second cup of coffee and trying to ignore the tremor in his hands. The coffee helped steady them some, though he knew it was borrowed relief. At 58, his body carried the accumulated weight of too many hard years, the limp from a Mustang that had rolled him outside Dodge City, the scar along his jaw from a saloon fight he barely remembered, and the hollow look that comes from staring too long into the bottom of too many whiskey bottles. But this morning felt different. This morning he had purpose. He reached inside his vest pocket and pulled out a small daguerreotype, its silver surface clouded with age and handling. The image showed a mare standing in tall grass, her copper coat gleaming in captured sunlight, with a foal pressed close to her side. The foal's coat was the color of burnished gold, with a white blaze running down her face like a lightning bolt frozen in time. Jubilee, even in the daguerreotype. You could see something special about that young horse. The way she held her head, alert but unafraid. The perfect lines that spoke of good breeding and better instincts. Boone had commissioned this image himself 15 years ago, when the world still made sense and his name carried weight from the Missouri River clear to the Sierra Nevada. She's going to be something extraordinary, he told Sarah that day, cradling the newborn foal while her mother whinnied soft reassurances. Sarah had laughed, her calico dress catching the breeze as she leaned against the corral rail. You say that about every foal. Boone Keller. This one's different, he'd insisted, and time had proven him right. Those had been the golden years. Boone's reputation as a horse trainer stretched from the cattle drives of Texas to the mining camps of Colorado. Ranchers would ride hundreds of miles just for the chance to have him work their horses. He had a gift. Some called it magic, for seeing what a horse could become before the animal knew it itself. His spread had covered 400 acres of prime grassland along Willow Creek, with corrals built from the finest timber, a barn that could house 30 horses and paddocks that were never empty. The house Sarah had designed sat on a gentle rise overlooking the training grounds, with wide windows that let her watch him work while she tended to her garden and raised their boy. Thomas Jubilee had been his masterpiece. From that first day, stumbling on uncertain legs, she'd shown an intelligence and willingness that set her apart from every other horse he'd trained. Boone had spent countless hours with her, building trust through patient consistency, teaching her to respond not just to rein and spur, but to the subtle shifts in weight and intention that separated good horsemanship from true partnership. By the time she was 3 years old, Jubilee could cut cattle with the precision of a master craftsman. She could run like the wind itself, navigate rough country with the confidence of a mountain goat, and was gentle enough that Sarah could ride her bareback through the meadows in the evenings. More than once, wealthy ranchers from back east had offered serious money for her. But Boone had always declined. Some things aren't for sale, he'd tell the would-be buyers, and Sarah would squeeze his shoulder in silent agreement. The fever had taken their son first. Thomas, barely 8 years old, burning up despite everything the doctor could do. Sarah had nursed him for weeks, never leaving his bedside until the boy's spirit finally gave up fighting. She'd followed him 6 months later, worn down by grief and the same fever that had claimed half the town that terrible winter. Boone had tried to drown his sorrows in work, pushing himself and his horses harder than ever. But grief has a way of turning medicine into poison, and before long, the whiskey bottle was making decisions for him. The ranch had fallen into disrepair. Clients stopped coming. Bills piled up like winter snow. The divorce, if you could call it that in those days, had been swift and merciless. Sarah's brother Marcus had ridden out from St. Louis with legal papers and a sheriff's deputy, claiming Boone was unfit to manage the property. The courts had sided with blood over marriage, awarding the land, the house, and most of the horses to Sarah's family. Jubilee had been the hardest part to lose. Standing in that courthouse, listening to the judge award custody of his horses to Marcus Whitfield, Boone had felt something break inside him that had never quite healed. Marcus had promised to take good care of the animals, and Boone believed he would. But promises don't fill the empty spaces where your heart used to be. The years after had blurred together in a haze of small towns and smaller jobs. He'd worked ranches from Montana Territory to New Mexico, never staying long enough to put down roots or form attachments. His reputation preceded him sometimes, opening doors, more often closing them, when word got around about his drinking. Pete Hawkins had been the one constant through it all. They'd known each other since their cavalry days, back when they were young soldiers fighting Indians and chasing dreams of glory on the frontier. Pete had aged more gracefully, settling into a life of steady work and quiet contentment on a small ranch outside Silver Basin. He'd offered Boone a place to stay more times than either of them could count. You can't keep drifting forever, Pete would tell him during their occasional encounters in various frontier towns. Some things follow you no matter how far you ride. I ain't drifting, Boone would reply, though they both knew it was a lie. It had been Pete who'd ridden out to find him 3 months ago with the news that Marcus Whitfield was selling Sarah's horses. Not all of them. He'd kept a few for his own use, but most of the herd would go through the annual Silver Basin horse trading post. Jubilee's on the list, Pete had said quietly, and Boone had felt the world tilt on its axis. That night, for the first time in years, Boone had put down the bottle before it was empty. He'd walked out to his saddlebags and retrieved a small leather portfolio, a collection of papers where he'd been tracking every dollar he could save, every coin he could set aside from his wages and odd jobs. The amounts were modest, but they'd accumulated slowly and steadily over the years, like water filling a desert spring. He'd been saving for something, though he hadn't known what. Maybe a down payment on a small piece of land. Maybe just the security of knowing he could survive if work dried up. But looking at those figures in the lamplight, with Pete's words echoing in his ears, Boone had finally understood what he'd been preparing for. This moment. This chance to reclaim the one thing that still mattered. The daguerreotype trembled slightly in his hands as he studied Jubilee's image. 15 years old now, she'd be in her prime. Still young enough to have good years ahead, old enough to have wisdom. He wondered if she'd remember him, if she'd recognize his voice or the way he moved around horses. More importantly, he wondered if he'd be allowed the chance to find out. Boone tucked the daguerreotype carefully into his vest pocket. He finished his coffee, stood from the wooden chair and walked back into the cabin. There was work to do if he wanted to be ready for the trading day next week. He had money saved, but money alone wouldn't be enough. He needed to look respectable, presentable, like someone the trading post managers would take seriously. The man in the small mirror above his wash basin stared back at him with hollow eyes and a week's worth of stubble. His hair hung past his shoulders, grey-streaked and unkempt. His clothes were clean but worn, suitable for ranch work but not for polite society. The scar on his jaw seemed more prominent than he remembered, and there were new lines around his eyes that spoke of too many sleepless nights, but beneath the accumulated damage of hard living. Something else flickered, a determination that had been sleeping for too long. Boone reached for his razor and began to make plans. The Silver Basin horse trading post was a 3-day ride from his cabin. He'd need to leave by Wednesday to arrive in time for the preview on Friday. His bay-gelding Chester was sound enough for the journey, though the horse showed his age in the careful way he picked his footing these days. Like his owner, Chester had seen better years, but there was still strength in both of them when it mattered. Boone spent the rest of the morning going through his meager possessions, selecting what he'd need for the journey. His good shirt, mended but clean. His father's old cavalry jacket, which still fit if he didn't breathe too deep. The leather portfolio with his savings documentation. And most importantly, the small roll of bills he'd accumulated over 15 years of careful penny pinching. The money felt substantial in his hands, more than he'd held at one time since his prosperous days. It represented years of choosing beans over beef, water over whiskey, necessity over comfort. Every dollar had been earned through honest work and preserved through honest need. But would it be enough? Horse prices had climbed considerably since his days as a trainer. What had once cost a month's wages now might require half a year's earnings. And Jubilee wasn't just any horse. She was prime stock from a known bloodline, trained to a level that commanded premium prices. The uncertainty gnawed at him like an old wound, but it couldn't shake his resolve. He'd find a way to make his money sufficient. He had to. As the afternoon sun slanted through his single window, Boone laid out his traveling gear on the rough pine table. Saddle blankets, bedroll, enough food for the journey, grain for Chester. The daguerreotype went into his vest pocket, where he could feel its weight against his chest. Tomorrow he'd begin the final preparations. He'd clean himself up proper, maybe even visit the barber in town if he could spare the money. He'd oil his saddle and check Chester's shoes. He'd practice the words he'd use when he introduced himself to the trading post managers, but tonight he allowed himself to remember better times. Times when his word alone could secure a horse deal, when his reputation opened doors instead of closing them, when the future looked as bright and promising as a foal, taking its first steps in the morning sun. Sarah's voice seemed to whisper through the evening air, carried on the wind that stirred the cottonwoods. Some things are worth fighting for, Boone Keller. He'd fought for her once and lost. He'd fought for their son and lost. Now he had a chance to fight for Jubilee, to reclaim at least one piece of the life he'd thrown away. This time, he intended to win. The Silver Basin horse trading post had grown considerably since Boone's last visit. What had once been a modest corral and trading shed beside the town's main street now sprawled across several acres on the outskirts, complete with professional holding pens, covered pavilions for examining stock, and enough space to accommodate wagons and riders from 3 territories. Even on preview day, the activity buzzed with the energy of serious money-changing hands. Boone guided Chester through the main gate, past a row of fine carriages and well-appointed wagons that belonged to successful ranchers, horse dealers, and wealthy settlers from back east. His own mount looked tired and weathered by comparison, and Boone's trail-worn appearance marked him as someone from outside their social circle. He'd done what he could with his appearance, shaved with his best razor, tied his hair back neat, put on his cleanest shirt and least patched trousers. But riding toward the registration tent, Boone caught his reflection in a merchant's polished wagon side and realized how little difference it made. The years showed on him like brands on a hide, each one telling a story of poor choices and hard consequences. The registration table sat under a canvas pavilion, manned by 2 gentlemen in city clothes who looked distinctly out of place on the frontier. Behind them, a hand-painted sign proclaimed Silver Basin's premier horse trading establishment in ornate lettering that spoke of Eastern refinement. The younger man looked up as Boone approached, his expression already guarded and professional. "Good morning," the man said with careful politeness. "Are you here to register as a buyer?" "Yes, sir." Boone Keller. He dismounted and pulled out his leather wallet, extracting a letter of credit from the cattleman's bank in Billings and a folded document showing his available funds. The clerk's fingers moved efficiently across a ledger book. I don't see you in our records, Mr. Keller. Is this your first time at our establishment? No, sir. I've done business here before, but it's been some years. He nodded and began filling out a new buyer card. His colleague, an older gentleman with carefully waxed mustache and sharp eyes, had been watching the exchange with growing attention. Now he leaned forward, studying Boone with the kind of scrutiny usually reserved for questionable livestock. "Excuse me," the older man interrupted. "Mr. Keller, is it? I'm Harrison Whitmore, trading post manager. Might I speak with you privately for a moment?" Something in his tone made Boone's stomach tighten. But he nodded and followed Whitmore to a corner of the pavilion, away from the other prospective buyers, browsing the preview catalogues. "Mr. Keller," Whitmore began, his voice carefully measured, "I'm sure you understand that our establishment has built quite a reputation over the years. We cater to a very particular clientele. Serious buyers, established operations, gentlemen who represent the finest of our Western enterprise. I understand that. Sir, I'm looking at your documentation, and while your funds appear adequate, I must be frank with you. You don't seem to have established credentials or verifiable references in the horse trading community. Our reputation and relationships with quality stock providers require that we be very selective about who we allow to participate." Boone felt heat rising in his chest. "Sir, I've got proper funds and honest intentions. I'm a qualified buyer." "I'm sure you are," Whitmore said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "But this isn't merely about money, Mr. Keller. It's about maintaining the integrity and standing of our operation. Our consigners and buyers expect a certain standard of participant. What standard is that?" Whitmore glanced toward the preview area, where well-dressed families examined horses while discussing bloodlines and breeding programs. "I think you can see for yourself. This is a respectable establishment, Mr. Keller. We have ladies present, prominent citizens observing our proceedings. We simply cannot accommodate anyone who might create an uncomfortable atmosphere." The words hit him like a physical blow. Boone looked down at himself, seeing what Whitmore saw: the worn boots, the sun-weathered skin, the accumulated evidence of a hard life lived on the margins. In his eyes, Boone wasn't a former trainer with decades of experience. He was just another saddle tramp who'd wandered in from the trail. "I'm not here to cause trouble," he said quietly. "I just want to bid on a horse." "I'm certain you do, but I'm afraid we can't accommodate that. Perhaps you'd be more comfortable at one of the smaller trading posts. There's a decent operation up in Helena next month that might be more suited to your circumstances." The dismissal was gentle, but absolute. Whitmore pulled a pre-printed card from his vest pocket and handed it to Boone, an official-looking document that was really just a polite way of documenting his rejection. The card read, "Buyer registration declined," in neat script, with Whitmore's signature below. "I do hope you understand this isn't personal. Mr. Keller, we simply have standards to maintain for the benefit of all involved." Boone accepted the card with as much dignity as he could muster. Around him, the business of the trading post continued. Wealthy buyers examining bloodlines, discussing breeding programs, making deals worth more than he'd earn in several years. "I understand," he said finally. Whitmore's expression softened slightly, perhaps recognizing the dignity in Boone's acceptance. "I truly hope you can appreciate our position. Mr. Keller, these decisions aren't made lightly." He folded the rejection card carefully and tucked it into his vest pocket, then walked back through the registration area past the younger clerk, who carefully avoided eye contact. Other potential buyers had witnessed his quiet humiliation, and he felt their gazes follow him as he made his way toward the preview corrals. Outside, the trading continued around him as if nothing had happened. Families strolled between the holding pens, pointing out horses they might bid on, discussing conformation and training records. Children fed sugar cubes to gentle mares, while their parents conducted business with sellers and agents. Boone moved through it all like a ghost, drawn by a pull stronger than pride toward the section where Marcus Whitfield's horses were penned. He found them in the premium area, each animal wearing a number and accompanied by a detailed information placard. There were horses he recognized, a few he'd trained himself in the early years, but his eyes searched for only one. She was in pen 19, standing apart from the other horses with the quiet confidence he remembered. Age had filled out her frame and added wisdom to her eyes, but Jubilee was unmistakably the same horse he'd raised from a foal. Her golden coat gleamed in the afternoon sun, and the white blaze down her face still looked like captured lightning. A small crowd had gathered around her pen, drawn by her obvious quality. A gentleman in an expensive suit was discussing her bloodlines with what appeared to be his horse manager, pointing out her conformation while a lady who might have been his wife watched with obvious admiration. "Magnificent animal," someone said beside him. Boone turned to see an elderly cattleman, his face weathered but his clothes well maintained. "You thinking of making an offer?" "Was considering it," Boone replied. The cattleman studied him for a moment, and Boone braced himself for another dismissal. Instead, the man nodded slowly. "She's got excellent lines, fine movement. Whoever trained her knew their business." "Yes, sir." They did. Jubilee had noticed him standing there. She approached the fence with ears forward, curious about this familiar-looking stranger. When Boone extended his hand, she sniffed carefully, then pressed her muzzle against his palm, the same greeting she'd offered him as a foal. For a moment, 15 years collapsed into nothing. The weight of failures and regrets fell away, leaving only the simple connection between a man and a horse who remembered each other. Jubilee nickered softly, a sound that hit Boone like a punch to the heart. "You know her," the cattleman observed. "From long ago," Boone said. His voice came out rougher than he'd intended. "Well, she certainly remembers you. Horses don't lie about such things." The wealthy gentleman with the horse manager was still discussing Jubilee's qualities, now joined by two other prospective buyers. The bidding on her would be fierce, Boone realized. Even if he'd been allowed to participate, the competition would have driven the price beyond his means. He pulled the rejection card from his vest and looked at it again. The paper was heavy stock, with Whitmore's neat signature at the bottom and an embossed letterhead that spoke of established authority. At the top, in smaller print, it specified "declined due to insufficient social standing" as the reason for rejection. Boone folded the card carefully and tucked it back into his vest. Around him, the Trading Post preview continued its genteel bustle, but he no longer felt part of it. He was an outsider looking in, someone who didn't belong in this world of polished success and inherited wealth. But as he walked back toward where Chester waited patiently at the hitching rail, something hardened in his chest like cooling iron. They judged him by his appearance, dismissed him without knowing who he was or what he represented. Maybe they were right about his circumstances, but they were wrong about his worth. The trading wouldn't commence until tomorrow afternoon. That gave him time. Jubilee watched him leave, her intelligent eyes following his progress until he disappeared around the corner of the pavilion. She'd remember him, he was certain of that. The question was whether he'd find a way to get back to her. The rejection card crackled slightly in his vest pocket as he mounted Chester. He didn't throw it away. Instead, he pressed it flat against his chest, feeling Harrison Whitmore's signature through the fabric of his shirt. They'd made a mistake dismissing him so easily. Boone Keller might look like a broken-down saddle tramp, but broken things could sometimes surprise you with their hidden strength. He turned Chester toward town and rode away to make plans. The ride back to his cabin passed through familiar territory that might as well have been foreign country. Every stand of aspen and weathered fence post reminded Boone of the distance between who he used to be and who he'd become. The rejection card sat folded in his vest pocket like a brand on his conscience, its crisp edges rustling against his shirt with each movement of his horse. By the time he reached the turnoff to his property, the humiliation had crystallized into something harder and more useful. Anger was a luxury he couldn't afford, but determination, that was different. Determination was something he could harness like a green horse, break to his will, and ride toward a better outcome. Chester picked his way carefully down the familiar path to the cabin, his ears flicking back toward his rider as if sensing the change in mood. The old gelding had been with Boone through the worst of times, carrying him from job to job, from disappointment to disappointment, never complaining about the modest rations or the long days in the saddle. "Easy, boy," Boone murmured, patting the horse's neck. "Have we got some thinking to do?" He unsaddled Chester and turned him into the small corral behind the cabin, making sure the water trough was full and adding a measure of oats to the feed box. The familiar routine of caring for his horse helped settle his mind, giving his hands something useful to do while his thoughts churned through the day's events. Inside the cabin, Boone moved through his evening ritual with mechanical precision. Coffee in the pot, boots beside the door, hat hung on the peg he'd carved himself. But tonight, instead of reaching for the bottle that usually helped him forget the day's disappointments, he pulled out his leather portfolio and spread his savings documentation across the rough pine table. The numbers were modest, but real. 15 years of careful accumulation, of choosing between necessities and wants, of putting away every spare dollar he could manage. It represented sacrifice and discipline that few men could maintain over such a long period. It was enough for Jubilee, more than enough if he could find a way to use it. The problem wasn't money. The problem was acceptance. Boone studied the rejection card like a battle plan. Harrison Whitmore had been clear about his objections. Boone didn't look like their kind of buyer, didn't represent their standard of clientele. He'd been judged by his appearance and found wanting. That could be changed. He walked to the back of the cabin, where a trunk held the accumulated possessions of his adult life. Most of it was practical gear. Work clothes, rain slickers, a few tools he couldn't bear to sell. But buried beneath everything else, wrapped in an old cavalry blanket, was a smaller chest that had belonged to his father. Boone had opened this chest exactly twice since Lieutenant Frank Keller's funeral 20 years ago. Once when Sarah had insisted he should display some of the contents in their house, and once during the property settlement when he'd considered selling everything inside just to have something to trade for drinking money. He'd kept it both times, though he'd never been quite sure why. The chest opened with the familiar creak of old leather hinges. Inside, layers of oilcloth protected a collection of military memorabilia, photographs in uniform, campaign ribbons, and newspaper clippings that documented his father's service in the Indian Wars. Frank Keller had never talked much about his army days, but the evidence suggested he'd distinguished himself in difficult circumstances. At the bottom of the chest, wrapped in a square of blue wool, was his father's dress uniform belt with its brass buckle. The metal was tarnished with age, but the eagle and shield design was still sharp, surrounded by 13 stars and the inscription United States Cavalry. Below that, in smaller letters, were the words "For Valor" and a date from 1876. Boone lifted the belt and felt its surprising weight. His father had worn this uniform exactly once after leaving the service, to Boone's mother's funeral, standing straight and proud despite the grief that had been eating him alive. After that, it had gone into the chest with the rest of his military career, put away when he'd decided that being a father mattered more than being a hero. "Some things are worth more than glory," Frank had told him once, years later when Boone had asked about it. "But that doesn't mean glory ain't worth having." Looking at the belt now, Boone remembered other things his father had said. About dignity, about earning respect rather than demanding it, about the difference between being proud of what you'd accomplished and being ashamed of what you'd become. Frank Keller had died believing his son would amount to something worthwhile. He'd seen Boone's gift with horses and had been certain that talent would carry him to success and respect. The disappointment of the years since then had been Boone's alone to carry, but maybe it wasn't. Too late to prove the old man right. Boone set the belt on the table beside the rejection, a card, and walked outside into the growing dusk. Pete Hawkins lived a hard day's ride to the south, but there were ways to get messages through if a man knew the right people. The Pony Express might have ended years ago, But there were still riders who carried mail and messages for a reasonable fee. He saddled Chester again, despite the horse's reproachful look, and rode into Silver Basin as the first stars appeared overhead. The town was quiet this late, most respectable folks already home for the evening, but the saloon still showed lights and the sound of conversation. Boone found who he was looking for at a table near the back of the room. Jake Morrison ran messages and small packages throughout the territory, trading on his knowledge of the trails and his reputation for reliability. He was nursing a beer and playing cards with two local merchants, but he looked up when Boone approached. "Well, I'll be damned. Boone Keller. Haven't seen you in town for months. Got business to discuss if you've got time." Jake nodded toward an empty chair. "Always got time for paying customers. What do you need?" "Message carried to Pete Hawkins down on Sweetwater Creek. Can you get it there by tomorrow evening? For the right price, I can get it there by tomorrow afternoon." "What's the urgency?" Boone pulled out paper and pencil, thinking carefully about what he wanted to say. The message needed to be clear but discreet. Pete would understand the situation without having every detail spelled out. "Pete," he wrote, "need your help with the situation at the trading post. They turned me away today based on appearance. Planning to try again tomorrow, but need someone who can vouch for my character and abilities. Can you meet me at the Cattleman's Hotel by noon? We'll explain everything then. Your friend Boone." He folded the message carefully and handed it to Jake along with payment for the delivery. "This gets to Pete Hawkins personal, you understand? Not his hired hands, not his neighbors. Pete himself, understood. Anything else you need?" "Information. You know Harrison Whitmore at the trading post?" Jake's expression grew cautious. "Know of him. Eastern gentleman. Came out here about 5 years ago with plenty of capital. Bought into the trading business, made some changes that didn't sit well with the old-timers." "What kind of changes?" "Made it more exclusive, you might say. Used to be any man with honest money could bid on horses. Now they're particular about who they let participate. Some folks say it's brought a better class of stock to the market. Others say it's just snobbery dressed up as business sense." Boone nodded, filing the information away. "Much obliged, Jake." Back at the cabin, he sat at his table for a long time, turning his father's cavalry belt over in his hands. The brass was cool against his palms, solid and real in a way that reminded him of better times. Frank Keller had worn this belt because he'd earned it, because it represented something he'd accomplished through courage and dedication. Maybe it was time for his son to earn something too. Boone wrapped the belt carefully and returned it to the chest, but not before making a decision. Come tomorrow, when he rode back into that trading post, he'd be wearing his father's cavalry buckle. Not because he'd earned the right to its glory, but because he was finally ready to try earning something of his own. The rejection card still lay on the table, but it no longer looked like a defeat. Instead, it looked like a starting point, the last insult he'd accept. Without fighting back, he had until tomorrow afternoon to become the man Jubilee deserved to remember. The account book had started as necessity rather than hope. 3 years into his wandering period, when the blur of small frontier towns and temporary ranch jobs threatened to consume what little remained of his identity, Boone had bought a simple ledger from a general store in Laramie and begun recording every dollar that came and went. Now, sitting at his kitchen table in the pale morning light, he opened the ledger to pages that told the story of his slow climb back from the bottom. The handwriting varied from entry to entry, sometimes careful and measured when he'd been sober and focused, sometimes shaky when whiskey withdrawal had made his hands unsteady, but always present, always accounting for every penny. The early pages made for painful reading. Wages from 2-week ranch jobs, barely covering food and grain for Chester, with nothing left to save. Months where the only entries were for saddle repairs or medicine, eating away at what little he'd managed to accumulate. But somewhere around page 40, the pattern had shifted. The entries became more frequent, the amounts saved grew larger, and a purpose had begun to emerge from the chaos. Pete arrived as Boone was reviewing the final calculations, his horse lathered from hard riding. The older man knocked once and let himself in. and carrying a saddlebag that clinked with the sound of bottles and a rolled canvas that looked like official papers. "Got your message," Pete said. Settling into the chair across from Boone, Jake Morrison rode like the devil was chasing him. "Said you looked serious as a hanging judge." "Serious enough." Boone turned the ledger around so Pete could see. "Take a look at this." Pete's eyebrows climbed steadily as he scanned the columns of figures. "Sweet Jesus, Boone, you've been hoarding this money like a prospector hoards gold. 15 years, near about. Ever since I lost the ranch, this is considerable money. More considerable than I expected." Pete looked up from the ledger with new respect. "You really have been planning for something like this." "Didn't know what exactly. But I knew someday there'd be something worth fighting for." Pete unrolled his canvas bundle and spread several documents on the table. "Well, if you're serious about this fight, I brought some ammunition that might help. First thing, I asked around about Harrison Whitmore. He's tough, but not unreasonable, mostly. The real issue is the trading post's reputation. They've had problems in the past with buyers who couldn't cover their purchases, made them particular about who they let bid. I can cover mine. I believe you, but they don't know that. What you need is credibility, references from people they respect, proof that you're not just some drifter with a saddlebag full of cash." Boone studied the papers Pete had brought. Letters of introduction, trading post participation records, and a list of previous buyers and sellers. "Who do we know on this list?" "More than you might think. Tom Bradley runs cattle over in Yellowstone County. He's bought horses from the post for years. Sally Crowfeather has a horse operation up near the reservation. Even old Dutch Vanderberg still shows up every season, though mostly he just watches and remembers better times." The names were familiar, faces from the community Boone had once been part of. People who knew his reputation from the prosperous years before everything fell apart. The question was whether they'd be willing to stake their own standing on his current situation. "Think they'd vouch for me?" Only one way to find out. Pete reached into his saddlebag and pulled out several letters. "Already started making inquiries. Tom Bradley remembers you well enough to listen, seems hesitant to put himself forward. Sally Crowfeather, on the other hand, she learned horse training watching you work at a demonstration 10 years ago. As if Boone Keller claims he can bid responsibly, that's good enough for her. And the others? Mixed results. Some folks remember your troubles and aren't interested in risking their own reputations. But enough said yes to give you the foundation you need." The afternoon brought visitors Boone hadn't expected. Word had spread through the informal network of displaced cowboys and retired horse traders that someone was making a stand against the trading post's exclusionary practices. They arrived on horseback and in farm wagons, carrying coffee and the kind of quiet solidarity that comes from shared experience. Dutch Vanderberg was the first through the door, 74 years old, built like a fence post, with hands that had gentled more horses than most men would see in a lifetime. He'd lost his own ranch to drought and creditors, but had never lost the bearing that marked him as someone who knew his business. "Heard you're stirring up trouble, son," he said to Boone. But his tone was approving, trying to buy back a horse that belongs with me. "Same thing, near enough. What do you need?" They came throughout the afternoon, men and women who'd been pushed aside by changing times, who understood what it meant to be judged by circumstances rather than character. Mac Rodriguez, who'd trained cutting horses until rheumatism forced him out. Linda Crowfeather, whose family had been raising horses in the valley since before the army came. Even young Billy Shepherd showed up, barely 25, but already worn down by hard luck and harder bosses. "Whitmore turned you away because you don't look prosperous enough," Dutch asked, settling into a chair that creaked under his slight weight. "That's the size of it. Well, prosperous is something we can work on. But first, let's talk about what you're really up against." He pulled out a pipe and began filling it with practiced motions. That trading post used to be run by local folks who understood the country and the people in it. Now it's run by Eastern money that sees everything through the lens of profit and propriety. "Nothing wrong with profit," Mac Rodriguez said. "Problem is when profit gets confused with prejudice. Linda Crow Feather, a woman in her 40s whose weathered hands spoke of decades working with horses, nodded agreement. My grandfather traded horses with white men before there was a silver Basin. Always said the only color that mattered in a horse deal was the green of honest money. Times have changed, Billy Shepherd observed bitterly. Now they want to see your pedigree along with your horses. Maybe, Dutch said, striking a match to light his pipe. But times can change back, given the right push. As the evening wore on, the group began to form something approaching a plan. It wasn't elaborate or sophisticated, but it had the virtue of being achievable with the resources they had available. The key, Dutch explained, is making sure you don't show up looking like the same man they turned away yesterday. Clean clothes, proper grooming, maybe someone respectable to introduce you. I can clean up, Boone said. But I can't change who I am. Don't want you to change who you are, Pete said firmly. Want you to show who you are. There's a difference. Linda Crow Feather had been studying Boone's ledger during the conversation. This is impressive work, she said, running her finger down the columns of careful entries. Shows discipline, planning, commitment. Any reasonable person would see this and understand they're dealing with a serious buyer. Whitmore's reasonable, Dutch said. In his way. Problem is, he's also protective of his reputation. Show up looking like you can afford to be there. Bring someone he respects to vouch for you, and I think he'll give you a fair hearing. And if he doesn't? The old man's eyes glinted with something that might have been amusement. Well, there are other ways to make a point. But let's try the polite approach first. As the group prepared to leave, each of them committed to some part of the effort. Pete would ride to town early and arrange for proper clothing and grooming services. Linda would contact Sally Crow Feather about providing a formal reference. Mac would spread word among the other trading post regulars that Boone Keller was making a legitimate effort to participate. One more thing, Dutch said as he prepared to mount his horse. You got any of your father's military gear? His cavalry uniform and belt. Why? Wear the belt tomorrow. Whitmore's got respect for military service, and your father's record was something to be proud of. Won't hurt to remind folks you come from good stock. After they'd all gone, Boone sat alone with his ledger and his thoughts. The pages before him represented 15 years of hope, deferred and dreams saved in small increments. Tomorrow he'd find out if all that patience and discipline would be enough to earn him a chance at redemption. Outside, night sounds drifted through the open window, owls calling across the meadow. Coyotes singing in the distance, Chester moving quietly around his corral. Familiar sounds from a familiar place. But tomorrow would take him back into a world where he was no longer welcome, unless he could find a way to earn his place back in. The morning air carried the scent of sagebrush and the promise of summer heat as Boone walked to his small shed behind the cabin. Inside, wrapped in oiled canvas and stored in a wooden crate, were the few documents he'd managed to save from his prosperous years. Most of his business records had been lost in the property settlement, claimed by lawyers or destroyed in his bitter departure from the ranch. But some things had been too important to leave behind. He unwrapped the canvas carefully, revealing a collection of horse papers, breeding records, and training documentation. At the bottom of the pile, folded in a leather portfolio, were Jubilee's original registration documents, papers he'd filled out himself when she was barely a month old. The pedigree was handwritten in his own careful script, recording her bloodline back 3 generations on both sides. Her dam, Copper Bell, had been a paint mare with excellent cow sense and the kind of steady temperament that made her perfect for ranch work. The sire was a stallion named Thunder Creek, owned by a breeder up in Wyoming Territory, known for producing horses with intelligence and art. But the real value in these papers wasn't the bloodline, it was the training record Boone had meticulously maintained throughout. Jubilee's early years, every lesson, every milestone, every breakthrough was documented in his neat handwriting. The pages told the story of a partnership between man and horse that had been something special, even in a life filled with special horses. Day 30, first halter lesson. Accepted lead rope without fight. Shows natural curiosity and intelligence. Day 120, first saddle, blanket. Minor resistance initially, then relaxed. Excellent progress. Year 2, first ride with bit. Responsive to leg pressure, soft mouth, willing attitude. This horse has exceptional potential. Reading through the entries now, Boone could remember each training session as if it had happened yesterday. Jubilee had been different from the beginning, not just willing to learn, but eager to understand what was being asked of her. She'd absorbed lessons like a sponge absorbs water, each new skill building naturally on the last. By the time she was 4 years old, Jubilee could do things that took most horses years to master. She could work cattle with the intuition of an old ranch horse, navigate obstacles with the precision of a circus performer, and respond to her rider's intentions before they were fully formed. More importantly, she had the kind of personality that made everyone who met her fall a little in love with her. The sound of approaching hooves interrupted his memories. Through the window, Boone saw Pete riding up the path, leading a pack-horse loaded with supplies. Behind him came Sally Crow Feather on a sturdy bay mare, and bringing up the rear was Tom Bradley, the Yellowstone County rancher who'd been reluctant to commit to helping, but had apparently changed his mind. "Morning, Boone," Pete called as he dismounted. "Brought some reinforcements and supplies." Sally Crow Feather was a woman of mixed blood whose family had been in the horse business longer than most white settlers had been in the territory. Her grandmother had traded horses with Lewis and Clark, and her knowledge of bloodlines and conformation was respected throughout the region. She approached Boone with the directness that marked her character. "Pete tells me you're trying to buy back a horse that belongs with you," she said without preamble. "That's the size of it." "Ma'am, show me her papers." Boone handed over Jubilee's registration documents and watched as Sally studied them with professional attention. Her expression grew increasingly interested as she read through the training records. "You did all this work yourself?" "Every bit of it. From the day she was born until the day I lost her." "Lost her how exactly?" The story came out in careful detail. The fever that had taken Sarah and their son, the drinking that followed, the gradual deterioration of his business and reputation. Tom Bradley listened without judgment, his weathered face revealing nothing. But Sally Crow Feather nodded as if she'd heard similar tales before. "Property settlement gave everything to my wife's family," Boone concluded. "They had legal grounds and I was in no condition to fight it." "But you kept the papers," Sally observed. "Couldn't bear to let them go. Figured someday I might need proof that I'd been the one to train her." Tom Bradley spoke for the first time since arriving. "I remember you from the old days, Keller. You had a reputation for honesty and skill. That reputation doesn't just disappear because of hard times. Some folks seem to think it does. Some folks are wrong." Bradley's tone carried the authority of a man who'd succeeded in a difficult business through his own judgment of character. "I'll vouch for you at the trading post, if that's what you're asking." The pack horse Pete had brought was loaded with supplies that spoke of serious preparation. Clean clothes that looked like they'd fit Boone reasonably well, a new hat still holding its shape, even a pair of boots that appeared to be his size. There were also grooming supplies, soap, razors, hair pomade, and what looked like enough food for several people. "Figured we'd set up a proper camp," Pete explained. "Can't have you riding back and forth between here and town, wearing yourself and Chester out. We'll establish ourselves at the hotel tonight, get you cleaned up proper, and make sure everyone at the trading post knows you're a serious buyer." Sally Crow Feather was still studying Jubilee's training records. "These are impressive documents," she said finally. "Any horse trainer would recognize the quality of work represented here. The question is whether Harrison Whitmore understands enough about horses to appreciate what he's looking at." "He understands money," Tom Bradley said dryly. "That's usually enough." "Maybe, but this situation is about more than money. It's about respect and belonging, and whether a man can earn his way back into a community that's forgotten who he used to be." As the afternoon progressed, more supporters arrived. Word was spreading through the informal network of horse people, retired cowboys, and others who'd found themselves on the outside of Silver Basin's increasingly exclusive society. They came with offers of help, references, and moral support. Linda Crow Feather arrived with her brother James, who worked as a blacksmith and had connections throughout the territory. Mac Rodriguez brought his nephew Carlos, a young man who'd been trying to establish himself as a horse trader but had encountered his own difficulties with the trading post's gatekeepers. "It's not just about you anymore," Dutch Vanderberg observed, settling into a chair with his usual deliberate movements. "Word's gotten around that someone's finally willing to stand up to Whitmore's snobbery. Folks are taking sides. I don't want to cause trouble for anyone else," Boone said. "Too late for that. Trouble's already here. Question is whether we're going to let it stand, or whether we're going to do something about it." As evening approached, the group began making specific plans for the next day's effort. Pete would arrange rooms at the hotel and coordinate the transformation of Boone's appearance. Sally and Tom would arrive early at the trading post to establish their presence as respected members of the horse community. The others would position themselves strategically throughout the preview area, ready to provide moral support and witness whatever happened. "Remember," Dutch said as they prepared to depart for town, "you're not going there as a supplicant asking for charity. You're going there as Boone Keller, horse trainer, with legitimate business to conduct. The fact that they turned you away yesterday was their mistake, not your failure." Boone folded Jubilee's papers carefully and tucked them into his vest pocket, next to his father's military belt. Tomorrow he'd present both documents to Harrison Whitmore, proof of his own accomplishments and evidence of the family honor he represented. The registration papers felt substantial against his chest, tangible evidence of work well done and partnerships built through patience and skill. Whatever happened at the trading post, he'd go there knowing exactly who he was and what he'd contributed to the world. The question was whether that would be enough to earn him the right to reclaim what he'd lost. The letter had been tucked inside his father's cavalry Bible, folded small and pressed between the pages like a dried flower. Boone discovered it while packing his few good belongings for the journey to town, his fingers brushing against the unexpected texture of paper among the familiar leather and gilt edges. His hands trembled slightly as he unfolded the delicate stationery. Sarah's handwriting flowed across the page in the elegant script she'd learned at the Young Ladies' Academy back in St. Louis, before she'd chosen love over comfort and followed him to the Montana Territory. "My dearest Boone," the letter began, "I found myself unable to sleep tonight, thinking about all the things I should have said, but never quite found the words for." The letter was dated just 2 months before the fever took her, written during one of his extended absences when he'd been off training horses for a wealthy rancher in Colorado. Reading it now, Boone could see the gentle reproach between the lines, the way she tried to call him back to what mattered most without seeming to criticize or demand. "Thomas asks about you every day. When will Papa be home? What horses is he working with now? He practices with his rope in the yard, trying to throw loops like you showed him. I think he believes that if he becomes skilled enough, you'll stay home longer." The words hit him like physical blows. He remembered that trip to Colorado. The money had been too good to refuse, and the rancher's horses had presented interesting challenges. He'd stayed 3 weeks longer than planned, seduced by the work and the praise, and the distance from domestic responsibilities that sometimes felt suffocating. "I know the work is important to you," Sarah continued. "I would never ask you to be less than you are, or to ignore the gifts God gave you. But sometimes I wonder if you understand that the best thing you ever trained was not a horse at all. It was the love we built together, and the family we created from nothing but hope and determination." Pete found him sitting on his cabin steps an hour later, the letter still clutched in his hands. The older man took one look at Boone's face and settled beside him without asking questions. "Found something that hurt?" Pete asked quietly. "Found something that explains a lot." Boone handed him the letter, watching as Pete read through Sarah's gentle words. "She loved you," Pete said finally. "She loved who I used to be. Maybe who I could have been if I'd made different choices. Maybe who you still could be." They rode to town in companionable silence, Chester and Pete's mount picking their way carefully down the dusty trail that led to Silver Basin. Behind them, a pack horse carried the supplies for Boone's transformation, while ahead lay the cattleman's hotel and the most important gamble of his life. The hotel was a substantial building by frontier standards. 3 stories of milled lumber and glass windows that spoke of prosperity and permanence. The proprietor, a German immigrant named Klaus Brennan, greeted them with the professional courtesy that came from running the only decent accommodation in town. "Mr. Hawkins, good to see you again. And this would be your friend, Boone Keller," Pete said before Boone could introduce himself. "He'll be needing your finest room and full grooming services. We've got important business tomorrow." Klaus studied Boone with the practiced eye of a man who'd learned to assess guests quickly and accurately. Whatever he saw seemed to satisfy him, because he nodded and reached for his register book. "Of course. Room 12, second floor, overlooking the street. Wilhelm can assist with grooming and clothing. Shall I arrange for dinner to be sent up?" The transformation began immediately. Wilhelm, Klaus's son, proved to be surprisingly skilled at the delicate work of rehabilitating a man's appearance. He started with a hot bath, the first Boone had enjoyed in longer than he cared to admit, followed by a professional shave that left his face feeling raw and unfamiliar. "You have good bone structure," Wilhelm observed, studying Boone's reflection in the mirror. "The weathering speaks of experience, not damage. With the right clothes and bearing, you will present very well." The clothes Pete had brought fit better than expected. The shirt was white cotton, starched and pressed. The trousers were dark wool, cut in the style favored by successful businessmen. The vest was plain but well made, providing a place to display his father's cavalry belt buckle without seeming ostentatious. When Wilhelm finished his work, the man in the mirror looked like a stranger, familiar but transformed. The unkempt hair had been trimmed and styled. The beard was gone, revealing the strong jaw that had been hidden for years. The clothes gave him an appearance of substance and respectability that had been missing from his life since the ranch days. "Remarkable," Pete said when Boone emerged from the hotel room. "You look like the man I used to know. Feel like I'm wearing a costume." "Good. That means you understand the performance aspect of what we're trying to accomplish. Tomorrow you're not just Boone Keller the broken-down cowboy. You're Boone Keller the horse trainer, temporarily down on his luck but ready to reclaim his place in the world." They met with the supporters that evening in the hotel's dining room. Sally Crowfeather and Tom Bradley had both arrived in town, along with Dutch van der Berg and several others. The group filled a large table near the back of the room, their conversation attracting attention from other hotel guests and local diners. "Marcus Whitfield's in town," Sally reported. "Sarah's brother, the one who ended up with her horses. I saw him at the trading post this afternoon, going over Jubilee's documentation with potential buyers." "How did she look?" Boone asked, though he dreaded the answer. "Like a horse that's been well cared for but underutilized. She's in good flesh, sound, but you can see she misses having regular work. Standing in that pen, she looked like she was waiting for something." Tom Bradley leaned forward. "I made some discreet inquiries about her current situation. Whitfield's kept her primarily as a brood mare, though she's only thrown 2 foals in the past 10 years. He's selling her because he's consolidating his operation, focusing on cattle rather than horses. What's the estimated bidding going to be like?" "Hi! Word's gotten around about her bloodline and training. There's a wealthy rancher from Denver who's expressed serious interest, plus at least 3 local buyers who recognize her quality." The conversation continued late into the evening, covering strategy, contingencies, and the various ways things could go wrong. But beneath the tactical discussion, Boone sensed something else. A growing sense of community among people who'd felt excluded or diminished by the changing social dynamics of the territory. "This is bigger than just one horse," Linda Crowfeather observed. "It's about whether ordinary folks still have a place in a world that's becoming increasingly controlled by Eastern money and Eastern attitudes." "Don't make it political," Dutch warned. "Keep it personal and specific." "Boone wants to buy back a horse he trained and loved. Simple as that. As the evening wound down, Boone found himself back in his room with Sarah's letter, reading her words again by lamplight. The woman who'd written these lines had seen something in him worth loving, worth building a life around. She died believing he could overcome his weaknesses and reclaim his better nature. Tomorrow, he'd find out if she'd been right. Outside his window, Silver Basin settled into its evening quiet. Somewhere out at the trading post, Jubilee was spending another night in an unfamiliar pen, waiting for whatever fate the morning would bring. In less than 12 hours, they'd discover whether 15 years of separation could be bridged by determination, preparation, and the kind of love that survives even death. Boone folded the letter carefully and placed it next to his father's belt buckle on the nightstand. 2 talismans from the people who'd believed in him when he'd forgotten how to believe in himself. Tomorrow, he'd honor their faith by becoming the man they'd always known he could be. The banker's letter arrived at dawn, carried by a messenger who'd ridden through the night from Billings. Klaus Brennan knocked softly on Boone's door, apologizing for the early hour, but explaining that the rider had insisted on immediate delivery. "Special correspondence from the Cattleman's Bank," Klaus said, handing over the sealed envelope. The messenger said it was urgent business regarding today's trading. Boone's hands were steady as he broke the wax seal, though his heart hammered against his ribs. Inside was a formal letter on bank letterhead, signed by President William Forrester himself, along with a detailed accounting that made his breath catch in his throat. Pete knocked and entered as Boone was reading the documents a second time, trying to absorb their full meaning. "Morning, partner. Ready for the big day?" Pete's cheerful greeting died when he saw Boone's expression. "What's wrong? Bad news?" "Not bad. Surprising." Boone handed him the banker's letter. Pete's eyes widened as he scanned the official documentation. "Jesus Christ, Boone. This says you have—" He stopped and read the figures again, his lips moving silently. "This can't be right." "It's right. I had them verify everything twice before having this prepared, but this is serious money." "More than serious. This is rancher money, businessman money. Where the hell did it all come from?" Boone walked to the window, looking out at the dusty street where early morning traffic was already beginning to stir. 15 years of living like a monk, Pete. 15 years of choosing work over comfort, saving over spending, discipline over indulgence. But the amounts here, some of these entries are massive. Hundreds of dollars at a time. How does a traveling cowboy save hundreds of dollars? You remember the Bitterroot Creek job 3 years ago? The one that kept me away for most of the summer? Vaguely, you were working for some wealthy cattleman, training his remuda for trail driving. Hamilton Stewart owned half of central Montana, needed someone to prepare 60 head of horses for a drive to the railhead in Billings. Difficult horses, most of them barely broke, some with serious behavioral problems. Pete nodded, still studying the bank documents. "I remember you saying it was challenging work. It was also the best-paying job I'd ever taken. Stewart offered me $1 a day per horse, plus bonuses for any animal that completed the drive successfully. Told him I'd do it for $2 a day per horse, figuring he'd negotiate down or find someone cheaper. And he agreed immediately, said if I could deliver what I promised, the money was irrelevant. Turned out he'd lost 3 previous trail herds because the horses weren't properly prepared. Cost him thousands in lost cattle and missed contracts." Pete whistled low. 60 horses at $2 a day. That's over $100 a week. How long were you there? 14 weeks. Every single horse completed that drive in perfect condition. Stewart paid me the full amount plus a bonus that nearly doubled it. Boone turned away from the window. I lived on beans and hardtack the entire time, spent nothing on luxuries, saved every penny. There are other entries here just as large. The Copper Creek Ranch job, the Mustang gentling contract down in Wyoming, the breeding program consultation in Colorado. Each job had been a test of his skills and endurance, opportunities he'd pursued not for the adventure, but for the financial security they represented. I took the difficult jobs, the ones other trainers wouldn't touch. Paid better, and I needed every dollar I could earn. The full scope of Boone's sacrifices became clear as he detailed the past 15 years. While other men had spent their wages on saloon entertainment, hotel rooms and decent meals, Boone had lived like a hermit, investing everything in a future he hadn't fully understood until now. I slept under the stars, more nights than I can count, cooked my own meals over campfires, mended my own clothes until they fell apart. Every dollar I didn't spend on comfort went into that account. He gestured toward the banker's letter. I told myself I was saving for security, for old age, for a place of my own someday. But I think I always knew what I was really saving for. Pete studied the documentation with new respect. This changes everything, you know. Walking into that trading post with this kind of financial backing, Whitmore's going to see you very differently. That's what I'm counting on. Word of the banker's letter spread quickly through their support network. By the time they gathered for breakfast in the hotel dining room, Sally Crow Feather, Tom Bradley, and Dutch van der Berg had all heard rumors about Boone's financial revelations. Is it true? Sally asked without preamble. Klaus Brennan's telling everyone you've got enough money to buy half the horses at the trading post. Boone handed her the banker's letter. Her expression shifted from skepticism to amazement as she read the official figures. This is extraordinary. I knew you were serious about buying Jubilee back, but this level of preparation, this is the work of years. 15 years, Dutch said, reading over her shoulder. 15 years of living like a man with a mission, even when he didn't fully understand what that mission was. Tom Bradley shook his head in wonder. I've known successful ranchers who couldn't show this kind of financial documentation. You're not just a legitimate buyer, Boone. You're one of the most qualified buyers who'll set foot in that trading post today. The revelation had a profound effect on the group's confidence and strategy. What had begun as a sympathy effort to help a down-on-his-luck cowboy reclaim a cherished horse had transformed into something much more significant. Boone wasn't a supplicant seeking charity. He was a serious businessman with the resources to compete with anyone. We need to adjust our approach, Sally observed. Instead of asking Whitmore to give you a chance, we should be presenting you as someone the trading post would be fortunate to accommodate. As they prepared to leave for the trading post, Boone felt the weight of expectations shifting around him. His supporters moved with new purpose. Their conversations focused on strategy rather than sympathy. Even his own reflection in the hotel mirror seemed different, not just cleaned up and respectably dressed, but carrying the bearing of a man with substantial resources and clear objectives. The ride to the trading post took on a ceremonial quality. Pete and Boone led the procession, followed by Tom Bradley and Sally Crow Feather, with Dutch van der Berg and several others bringing up the rear. Other riders and wagons joined them along the way, word having spread through the community that something significant was happening. Look at that, Pete said, as they crested the hill overlooking the trading post grounds. Half the territories turned out to watch this. The preview area was more crowded than Boone had ever seen it. Along with the usual collection of serious buyers and casual observers, there were dozens of people who'd come specifically to witness his return. Cowboys, small ranchers, retired horse trainers, and others who'd felt excluded by the trading post's increasingly exclusive atmosphere. Harrison Whitmore was waiting near the registration tent, his expression carefully neutral. He'd obviously heard about the banker's letter and understood that his previous dismissal of Boone had been a serious miscalculation. "Mr. Keller," he said as Boone dismounted, "I understand you've returned to register as a bidder." "That's correct." "Mr. Whitmore, I believe we had some miscommunication yesterday about my qualifications." Whitmore's eyes flicked to the banker's letter that Boone held prominently in his hand. "Indeed, perhaps we should discuss your registration privately, away from the crowd." "I don't think that's necessary," Boone replied calmly. "My qualifications are a matter of public record, and I see no reason for privacy." He handed the banker's letter to Whitmore, watching as the trading post manager's face changed color while reading the financial documentation. Around them, the crowd pressed closer, sensing that something important was happening. "This is—" Whitmore cleared his throat. "These are very substantial credentials, Mr. Keller. Very substantial indeed. Adequate for your requirements, I trust?" "More than adequate. Exceptionally adequate." Whitmore's voice carried across the crowd, reaching spectators who'd gathered to witness what they expected would be another humiliation. "The Silver Basin Trading Post would be honored to register you as a qualified bidder." A murmur went through the assembled crowd, not the satisfied murmur of justice served, but the surprised murmur of expectations overturned. Many of them had come expecting to see Boone turned away again, perhaps more harshly this time. Instead, they were witnessing Harrison Whitmore treat the man he'd dismissed yesterday as one of his most valued customers. "I'll need bidder number 47, Boone said, remembering Jubilee's pen number from his previous visit. Of course, an excellent choice. Whitmore personally prepared Boone's bidder card, his hands slightly unsteady as he filled in the registration information. As they walked toward the horse pens, Pete leaned close to Boone's ear. 47's got special meaning? That was Jubilee's pen number yesterday. Seemed appropriate. The transformation in how people looked at him was immediate and dramatic. Conversations stopped as he passed, replaced by respectful nods and curious glances. Word was spreading quickly through the preview crowd that the man Harrison Whitmore had rejected yesterday possessed financial resources that dwarfed most of the other bidders. "Amazing what a banker's letter can do," Dutch Vanderberg observed. "Yesterday you were a saddle tramp. Today you're a valued customer. Same man both days," Boone replied. "Only difference is what people choose to see," but even as he said it, Boone knew something fundamental had shifted. The revelation of his financial resources had changed not just how others saw him, but how he saw himself. For 15 years, he'd been living like a man preparing for something without knowing what it was. Now that the moment had arrived, he understood that all those years of sacrifice and discipline had been building toward this opportunity to reclaim not just Jubilee, but his place in a world that had forgotten his worth. The bidding wouldn't begin for several hours, but the real victory was already won. He'd proven that appearances could be deceiving, that judgment based on first impressions could be profoundly wrong, and that a man's true measure lay not in how he looked, but in what he'd accomplished when no one was watching. Now all that remained was to win back the horse that had started this entire journey 15 years ago. It had been waiting for him in his father's chest like a promise kept across decades. Not the standard cavalry campaign hat that Frank Keller had worn through dust and battle, but the formal dress hat reserved for ceremonies and special occasions. Black felt with a silk band, shaped to military specifications and maintained in perfect condition despite 20 years of storage. Boone lifted it from its bed of tissue paper with the reverence due a sacred object. His father had worn this hat exactly 3 times that Boone could remember: to his wedding, to his son's graduation from the territorial school, and to the ceremony where the territorial governor had commended his service during the Indian Wars. Each time, Frank Keller had stood straighter, spoken more formally, carried himself like a man conscious of representing something larger than his individual self. Today, "They wear it for you, old man," Boone said to the empty cabin. And for her, the transformation was complete. The clean clothes Pete had provided fit him like they'd been tailored specifically for his frame. The cavalry belt buckle gleamed against the dark wool of his vest. His boots were polished to a military shine, and his hair was trimmed and styled in a manner that spoke of substance and respectability. But the hat completed something more than his appearance. It completed his transformation from Boone Keller, the broken-down drifter, to Boone Keller, the accomplished horseman, temporarily fallen but never truly defeated. Outside, the morning air carried sounds of preparation from throughout the valley. Horses nickering in corrals, wagon wheels grinding along dusty roads, the distant calls of men organizing what promised to be the largest crowd in the trading post's history. Word had spread far beyond Silver Basin that something significant was happening, that a man who'd been written off and dismissed was making his stand. Pete arrived as the sun cleared the eastern ridge, leading not just his own horse but a magnificent bay gelding that Boone had never seen before. "Where'd that horse come from?" Boone asked, studying the animal's obvious quality. "Borrowed him from Tom Bradley. Figured if you're going to make an entrance, you ought to be mounted appropriately." Pete grinned. "Chester's a fine horse, but he looks like what he is, a working man's mount. This fellow looks like he belongs to someone with serious money." The bay was clearly a bred animal, probably worth more than most men earned in a year. His coat gleamed like polished copper. His mane was perfectly groomed, and his tack was the kind of hand-tooled leather work that marked its owner as someone of substance. "Tom's trusting me with considerable horseflesh. Tom's making an investment in seeing Harrison Whitmore eat some crow. Besides, he's seen your bank documentation. He knows you're good for any damages." As they prepared to leave, other members of their support network began arriving. Sally Crowfeather rode up, leading 2 additional horses, mounts for Dutch Vanderberg and Mac Rodriguez that matched the quality of Boone's borrowed bay. Linda Crowfeather appeared driving a small but elegant buggy that had obviously been borrowed for the occasion. "We're going to arrive looking like a delegation," Pete observed with satisfaction. "Like important people coming to conduct important business." "That's exactly what we are," Dutch said, settling his aged frame into the saddle with the careful precision of a man who'd been riding longer than most people had been alive. And it's time folks remembered it. The procession that formed on the road to Silver Basin was unlike anything the territory had seen. Boone rode at the front, his father's dress hat casting his face in dignified shadow, the bay horse stepping with the kind of precision that spoke of excellent training and careful handling. Behind him came his core supporters, all mounted on quality horses and dressed in their finest clothes. But as they neared town, others began joining them. Cowboys who'd worked with Boone in the past, small ranchers who'd bought horses from him in the prosperous years, even some townspeople who'd heard about his rejection and been offended by the implications for their community. By the time they reached the trading post grounds, their numbers had swelled to nearly 50 riders and a dozen wagons. "Jesus Christ," Pete muttered, looking back at the crowd following them. "This looks like a political rally." "Maybe that's what it is," Sally Crowfeather said. "Politics of inclusion versus exclusion, local people versus Eastern money." The trading post was already busy with preview activity, but everything seemed to pause as Boone's delegation arrived. Conversations stopped mid-sentence, horses turned to watch their approach, and even the children playing between the corrals fell silent to observe the spectacle. Harrison Whitmore stood near the registration tent, his face carefully composed, but his nervous energy visible in the way he repeatedly consulted his pocket watch and adjusted his tie. Beside him, several assistants held clipboards and ledger books, ready to manage what promised to be the most complex trading day in the post's history. Boone dismounted with deliberate ceremony, handing the bay's reins to Pete before approaching the registration area. His supporters remained mounted, forming a respectful semicircle that created a sense of occasion, while allowing other buyers to conduct their business. "Mr. Keller," Whitmore said, his voice carrying farther than necessary, "welcome back to the Silver Basin Trading Post. I trust you found your accommodations in town satisfactory." "Very satisfactory, thank you, Mr. Whitmore. I appreciate your establishment's attention to qualified buyers." The exchange was polite but formal, each man playing his role in a performance that had as much to do with public reputation as private business. Whitmore handed Boone his bidder registration card, number 47, as requested, with a flourish that suggested he was conferring a significant honor. "I trust you've had opportunity to review our catalog and preview the available stock. I have specific interest in Lot 19. The mare consigned by Marcus Whitfield. Ah, yes, Jubilee. Exceptional animal, exceptional bloodlines. We expect spirited bidding on that particular lot." I'm sure you do. The formal courtesies completed, Boone made his way toward the holding pens with his supporters flanking him like an honor guard. The contrast with his arrival yesterday could not have been more dramatic. Where he'd previously moved through the crowd as an unwelcome outsider, now people stepped aside respectfully, some nodding in greeting, others simply watching with the kind of attention reserved for significant events. Jubilee was in the same pen where he'd found her yesterday, but her demeanor seemed different, more alert, as if she sensed that something important was about to happen. When she saw Boone approaching, she moved immediately to the fence rail, pressing her muzzle against his outstretched hand with obvious recognition and pleasure. "She remembers you," a woman's voice said behind him. Boone turned to see Margaret Thornfield, not the auction coordinator he'd expected, but a handsome woman in her 40s, wearing a divided riding skirt and a hat that marked her as someone comfortable around horses. "You must be Boone Keller," she continued. "I'm Margaret Thornfield, Harrison's wife. I handle the livestock evaluation and catalogue preparation for the trading." "Post, ma'am!" Boone touched the brim of his father's hat respectfully. "Understand you have history with this particular mare. I trained her from a foal. Lost her in a property settlement 15 years ago." Margaret studied Jubilee with the practiced eye of someone who understood horses. "She's been well cared for, but she hasn't been worked consistently. You can see it in her bearing. She's sound and healthy, but she's waiting for something." Waiting for what? Purpose, partnership, the kind of relationship she obviously had with whoever trained her originally. Margaret looked directly at Boone. "Marcus Whitfield is a decent man, but he's primarily a cattle rancher. He's kept her as breeding stock, but that's not what she was bred for." The implication hung between them like a challenge. Jubilee had been created for partnership, for the kind of working relationship that required daily interaction and mutual respect. Keeping her as a broodmare was like using a concert piano as a doorstop. Functional, perhaps, but a waste of extraordinary potential. She's bred for riding, for working cattle, for the kind of partnership that makes both horse and rider better than they are separately, Boone said. "Exactly." Margaret's smile was genuine and warm. "I hope she finds her way back to that kind of life." As the afternoon progressed and the formal trading session approached, the crowd around the trading post continued to grow. Word had spread throughout the territory that something unprecedented was happening, that a man who represented the old ways, the traditional values of the frontier horse community, was making a stand against the increasingly exclusive policies that favored wealth over knowledge. "Look at this crowd," Dutch Vanderberg observed, settling beside Boone on a bench where they could watch both the growing audience and the continuing preview activities. "Haven't seen this many people gathered for anything since the territorial governor's visit. They're not here just for the trading," Sally Crowfeather added. "They're here to see whether an ordinary man with extraordinary determination can compete with money and influence." The tension was building toward something that felt larger than a simple horse auction. Representatives of different worldviews, different ways of life, were gathering for what increasingly felt like a referendum on the future character of their community. "Whatever happens in that ring," Pete said quietly, "you've already accomplished something important. You've reminded folks that worth isn't always visible on the surface. That judgment based on appearances can be profoundly wrong." Boone adjusted his father's hat and checked the bidder card in his vest pocket one final time. In less than an hour, the formal trading would begin, and with it, his chance to reclaim not just Jubilee, but his place in a world that had written him off as irrelevant. The afternoon sun was slanting lower, painting the entire trading post in golden light that made everything seem touched with possibility. Somewhere in the distance, a bell began ringing, the signal that bidding would commence in 15 minutes. It was time to discover what 15 years of sacrifice and preparation could purchase when backed by unshakable determination and the kind of love that survives even the longest separation. The bidding paddle was carved from a single piece of pine, sanded smooth and painted white with black numerals. that stood out clearly against the afternoon light. Number 47 felt solid in Boone's grip. Its weight modest but significant, the physical tool through which 15 years of sacrifice and preparation would either triumph or fail. Harrison Whitmore took his position at the auctioneer's podium, a raised platform that gave him clear sightlines to every potential bidder in the assembled crowd. His voice carried easily across the grounds as he opened the formal trading session with remarks about the quality of the stock and the distinguished nature of the assembled buyers. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the 47th Annual Silver Basin Premium Horse Trading. Today's offerings represent some of the finest bloodstock in the territory, consigned by breeders and ranchers whose reputations speak for themselves. The first horse brought into the ring was a sturdy working gelding, the kind of animal that formed the backbone of ranch operations throughout the territory. The bidding was steady but unremarkable, local ranchers competing for practical horseflesh at reasonable prices. Boone watched the process carefully, studying the rhythm of the auctioneer's chant, the way bidders signaled their intentions, the subtle dynamics that would soon determine Jubilee's fate. Sold for $38 to bidder number 12, Whitmore announced, bringing his gavel down with a sharp crack. Next lot, please. The early lots established the pattern and tenor of the day's trading. Working horses brought modest but fair prices. Breeding stock commanded premium dollars, and anything with exceptional bloodlines or training sparked competitive bidding that drove values significantly higher. Boone noticed the wealthy rancher from Denver that Tom Bradley had mentioned, a well-dressed man in his 60s, accompanied by what appeared to be a professional horse buyer. They bid selectively but aggressively, acquiring 2 premium mares and a young stallion with bloodlines that traced back to Kentucky racing stock. "That's Edmund Fairchild," Sally Crow Feather said quietly, nodding toward the Denver rancher. "Owns half the grazing land between the South Platte and the Arkansas rivers. Money's no object for him. What's his interest in Jubilee? Building a breeding program around proven bloodlines and performance records. A mare like her, with documented training accomplishments and solid conformation, would be a cornerstone acquisition for someone with his ambitions." As the afternoon progressed, the crowd's attention began focusing on the higher value lots. When a particularly fine cutting horse brought a bidding war that pushed the price to nearly $200, murmurs of excitement rippled through the assembled spectators. "That's serious money," Dutch Vanderberg observed. "Sets the bar pretty high for anything special that comes after." The community support that had rallied around Boone was visible throughout the trading grounds. His supporters had positioned themselves strategically, creating pockets of moral support and friendly faces wherever he looked. But they'd also attracted attention from other attendees who'd heard about the previous day's rejection and were curious to see how the situation would resolve itself. "Look at that," Pete said, gesturing toward a group of well-dressed couples who were clearly discussing Boone's presence. "Word's gotten around about your banker's letter. Some folks are recalculating their assumptions about who belongs here." Marcus Whitfield appeared near the bidding area as the lots approached Jubilee's number. Zara's brother had aged considerably since Boone had seen him last, his hair gone gray and his face bearing the kind of lines that came from years of difficult decisions. He nodded respectfully when their eyes met, a gesture that acknowledged shared history without suggesting friendship. "Boone," he said simply. "Marcus, she's been well cared for. I want you to know that. I can see that." "I'm grateful." The exchange was brief, but carried weight beyond its simple words. Both men understood that whatever animosity might have existed between them, it was secondary to their shared concern for Jubilee's welfare. "Next lot," Whitmore announced, his voice carrying across the suddenly quieter crowd. "Lot 19, registered mare, 15 years old. Extensively trained for ranch work and cattle operations. Consigned by Marcus Whitfield of the Willow Creek Ranch." 2 handlers led Jubilee into the trading ring, her copper coat gleaming in the slanted afternoon light. She moved with the fluid grace that had always marked her as something special, her head high and ears forward, alert to the attention she was receiving. When her eyes found Boone in the crowd, she nickered softly, a sound that carried clearly in the suddenly hushed atmosphere. "Beautiful animal," someone said behind Boone. "Look at that conformation. See how she carries herself? That's a horse that knows she's something special." Whitmore began his description of Jubilee's bloodlines, training record, and accomplishments, his auctioneer's patter building interest and anticipation among the potential bidders. Boone felt his heart hammering against his ribs as the moment he'd waited 15 years for approached. "Bidding opens at $50, Whitmore announced. "Do I hear 50? Edmund Fairchild's paddle went up immediately, establishing his serious intent from the opening bid. 2 local ranchers followed quickly, driving the price to $75 within seconds. Boone held his paddle steady, waiting for the right moment to enter the bidding. The numbers climbed steadily, $80, $90, $100. At $125, one of the local bidders dropped out, leaving Fairchild competing with a horse dealer from Billings and a rancher Boone didn't recognize. "Do I hear 150? Whitmore called. Fairchild nodded, his expression calm and determined. 150 from bidder 21. "Do I hear 60? The Billings dealer raised his paddle, and the tension in the crowd became palpable. This was serious money, the kind of bidding that separated casual interest from determined acquisition. Boone felt the weight of every eye in the crowd, the attention of his supporters, the curiosity of those who'd heard about his transformation but hadn't yet seen him compete with the territory's wealthiest buyers. The moment had arrived to discover whether 15 years of sacrifice would be enough to reclaim what he'd lost. He raised paddle 47 for the first time, his voice carrying clearly across the grounds. 175. A murmur went through the crowd, not just at the substantial bid, but at the confident manner in which it had been delivered. Boone Keller had announced his serious participation in the bidding for Jubilee, and the real competition was about to begin. The bidding war that followed moved with the relentless intensity of a summer storm. Edmund Fairchild responded to Boone's opening bid with grim determination, raising his paddle to signal $190. The Billings dealer, clearly recognizing that he was outclassed financially, shook his head and stepped back from the competition. 190 from bidder 21, Whitmore called, his auctioneer's rhythm building momentum that pulled the crowd deeper into the drama. "Do I hear 200? Boone felt the weight of every sacrifice that had brought him to this moment. The nights he'd slept under stars rather than paying for hotel rooms. The meals of beans and hardtack when he could have afforded decent food. The jobs he'd taken in the worst weather, working horses other men wouldn't touch. All to build the financial foundation that would allow him to compete with men like Edmund Fairchild. 200, he called clearly, raising paddle 47 with steady confidence. A ripple of excitement went through the assembled crowd. $200 for a single horse was extraordinary money, the kind of sum that represented serious wealth and serious determination. The competition had moved beyond practical considerations into the realm of prestige and passion. Fairchild studied Boone with new interest, reassessing the man who could bid so casually at such elevated levels. His own response came without hesitation. 225. The crowd was completely silent now, recognizing that they were witnessing something unprecedented. In the trading ring, Jubilee stood calmly despite the tension, her intelligent eyes moving between the competing bidders as if she understood that her future was being decided. Boone felt a moment of vertigo as he considered the size of his next bid. $250 was more money than most men in the territory would see in 2 years. It was enough to buy a small ranch, enough to set a man up for life if invested carefully. But looking at Jubilee, seeing the way she watched him with trust and recognition, he knew that some things transcended monetary calculation. 250, he said, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent trading grounds. Harrison Whitmore paused in his rhythm, clearly stunned by the escalation. $250 from bidder 47. Do I hear? 300, Fairchild interrupted, his calm mask finally showing cracks. The Denver rancher's jaw was set with the kind of determination that came from a man accustomed to winning whatever he wanted. Gasps and murmurs erupted from the crowd. $300 was rancher money, the kind of sum that marked its spender as someone of substantial means. Several people turned to look at Boone, wondering if the mysterious bidder could possibly match such an offer. Boone closed his eyes for a moment, feeling Sarah's presence like a whisper in his memory. He thought of his father's cavalry buckle pressing against his chest, of the years of patient sacrifice, of the trust in Jubilee's eyes when she'd recognized him despite 15 years of separation. When he opened his eyes, his voice was steady and sure. $400. The silence that followed was profound and complete. $400 wasn't just serious money, it was transformative money. The kind of sum that redefined everyone's understanding of who Boone Keller really was and what this mare meant to him. Edmund Fairchild stared at him for a long moment, clearly calculating whether to continue the bidding war. His professional horse buyer leaned close to whisper urgently in his ear, probably advising caution at such elevated levels. Finally, slowly, the Denver rancher shook his head and lowered his paddle. $400 from bidder 47, Whitmore called, his voice betraying his amazement. Going once at 400, the pause stretched like held breath across the entire trading post. Going twice at $400, Boone felt time slow to a crawl. Every heartbeat loud in his ears, every detail of the moment burning itself into his memory. Jubilee's ears were pricked forward, watching him with what looked like anticipation. His supporters stood motionless, afraid to break the spell. Even the children had stopped their playing to witness the conclusion of this extraordinary drama. Sold! Whitmore's gavel came down with a crack that seemed to echo across the entire valley. Lot 19 sold to bidder number 47 for $400. The explosion of sound that followed was unlike anything the Silver Basin trading post had ever heard. Cheers, applause, and shouts of amazement rose from the crowd as people processed what they'd just witnessed. Boone had not only reclaimed Jubilee, he'd done so in a manner that announced to everyone present that he was a man of substance who deserved respect. Pete reached him first, pounding his back with enthusiastic approval. Jesus Christ, Boone, $400. You just bought the most expensive horse in territorial history. Sally Crow Feather was grinning widely. Did you see Edmund Fairchild's face? He couldn't believe he'd been outbid. Dutch Vanderberg approached with tears in his eyes. Your father would have been proud, son. That was the kind of stand that means something, but Boone barely heard the congratulations surrounding him. His attention was focused entirely on Jubilee, who was being led toward him by one of the trading post handlers. When she saw him approaching, she nickered softly, the same greeting she'd offered him as a foal, the same sound that had echoed through his memory during 15 years of separation. Harrison Whitmore appeared at his elbow, carrying the official bill of sale. Mr. Keller, this is your receipt for the purchase of Lot 19. $400, paid in full according to your bank documentation. The receipt was written on heavy paper with the trading post's official seal, signed and witnessed according to territorial law. It was more than a business document. It was proof of restoration. Evidence that a man could lose everything and still find a way to reclaim what mattered most. She's yours again, Whitmore said, his tone carrying genuine respect. I hope you understand that yesterday's misunderstanding, yesterday's behind us, Boone said quietly, folding the receipt carefully and placing it in his vest pocket next to Sarah's letter and his father's cavalry buckle. What matters is today. He approached Jubilee slowly, extending his hand palm up in the same gesture he'd used when she was a curious foal. She sniffed delicately, then pressed her muzzle against his hand with obvious pleasure. When he reached up to stroke her neck, she leaned into his touch like she was coming home. "Hello, girl," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I told you I'd find a way back to you." Around them, the crowd continued to celebrate and discuss what they'd witnessed. But Boone was aware only of the warmth of Jubilee's neck beneath his hand and the quiet satisfaction of a promise kept across 15 years of separation. He was Boone Keller again, not the broken down drifter who'd been turned away in humiliation, but the man who'd loved this horse enough to sacrifice everything for the chance to bring her home. The new lead rope was made of the finest braided leather, soft to the touch but strong enough to hold the most spirited horse. The halter that accompanied it was crafted with the kind of attention to detail that marked it as the work of a master leather worker. Brass fittings that gleamed in the afternoon sun, stitching that would last for decades, and a fit that spoke of careful measurement and professional pride. "These are the finest tack I've ever owned," Boone said to Wilhelm, the hotel keeper's son, who had presented them as a gift from the community that had rallied around his cause. "They are from all of us," Wilhelm replied, his German accent thick with emotion. "From everyone who believed you deserved another chance, and from everyone who learned something about not judging by appearances." The sun was setting over the silver basin as Boone prepared to lead Jubilee home to his cabin. The crowd that had witnessed his triumph was gradually dispersing, but many lingered to offer congratulations, share memories of his earlier reputation, or simply to be part of a story they sensed would be told and retold throughout the territory for years to come. Pete helped him secure his few belongings to Chester's saddle, leaving the bay gelding to be returned to Tom Bradley with appropriate thanks. "You planning to ride her home?" he asked, nodding toward Jubilee. "Not tonight. Tonight we walk together, get reacquainted. There's no hurry now." The wisdom of this decision became clear as they set out along the familiar trail toward Willow Creek. Jubilee moved beside him with the easy grace he remembered, but there were subtle differences that 15 years had wrought. She was more mature, more thoughtful in her movements, carrying herself with the dignity that came from age and experience. "You've been waiting for this as long as I have, haven't you, girl?" Boone murmured, stroking her neck as they walked. "Waiting for someone who understood what you were meant for." The territory around them was bathed in the golden light of evening, painting the landscape in colors that made everything seem touched with promise. Meadowlarks called from fence posts, and the air carried the scent of sage and wildflowers that had always marked this country as home. As they walked, Boone found himself thinking about all the people who had made this day possible. Dutch van der Berg, whose stubborn insistence on dignity had helped him remember his own worth. Sally and Linda Crow Feather, whose expertise had validated his credentials. Pete Hawkins, whose loyalty had never wavered through the darkest years. Even Harrison Whitmore, whose initial rejection had forced him to prove rather than simply claim his value. "Funny how things work out," he said to Chester, who plodded along patiently beside them. "Sometimes the worst thing that happens to you turns out to be the thing that saves you." They paused at the small cemetery outside Silver Basin, where Sarah and Thomas were buried beneath simple granite markers that spoke of love rather than wealth. Boone had visited these graves exactly once since the funerals, unable to face the weight of loss and responsibility their presence represented. But tonight, with Jubilee standing quietly beside him and the victory receipt crinkling in his vest pocket, he found the courage to approach. "I brought her home, Sarah," he said quietly, his hat in his hands. "I know you worried about what would happen to her, worried that she'd end up with someone who didn't understand her potential. But I found a way to keep my promise." The evening breeze stirred the grass around the headstones, and for a moment Boone could almost hear Sarah's voice carried on the wind, not the bitter words of their final arguments, but the gentle encouragement she'd offered in the early years when his dreams seemed achievable and their future looked bright. "I've got plans, you know. Good plans this time. Going to start small, maybe take on a few training projects, build back some reputation. Jubilee and we've got plenty of good years left together." The walk home took nearly 2 hours, but neither time nor distance seemed important. What mattered was the simple pleasure of moving through familiar country with the mare who had been the finest achievement of his professional life. By the time they reached his cabin, full darkness had settled over the valley. But the clear sky was brilliant with stars that seemed to celebrate their homecoming. Boone led Jubilee to the small corral behind his cabin, where Chester was already waiting with patient curiosity about his new companion. The two horses sniffed each other carefully, establishing the social dynamics that would govern their shared future, while Boone filled water troughs and added fresh hay to their feeding stations. "Tomorrow we start over," he told Jubilee as he secured the new halter around her head. "Both of us. We'll take it slow, see what we remember, build back the partnership we used to have." Inside the cabin, he lit his oil lamp and spread the victory receipt on his kitchen table beside Sarah's letter and his father's cavalry buckle. 3 documents that together told the story of his journey from loss through redemption to renewal. The bank statement showing his remaining funds, still substantial despite the day's expenditure, promised security and opportunity for whatever came next. But more than the money, more than the validation of his worth, what mattered was the sound of Jubilee moving quietly around the corral outside his window. After 15 years of separation, they were together again, ready to discover what partnership could become when it was built on sacrifice, patience, and the kind of love that survives even the longest separation. The transformation that had brought him to this moment extended far beyond his own circumstances. Throughout the territory, people were reconsidering their assumptions about worth and dignity, about the difference between appearance and reality. Harrison Whitmore had announced that the trading post would be reviewing its customer policies to ensure that qualified buyers were never again dismissed based on superficial judgments. Maybe that's the real victory, Boone mused, settling into his chair on the small porch where he could watch over his horses. Not just getting Jubilee back, but proving that a man's worth isn't determined by how he looks in his worst moments. The night sounds of the prairie settled around them, owls calling across the meadows, coyotes singing in the distance, the quiet sounds of horses settling into sleep. Familiar sounds from a familiar place, but tonight they carried promises of better days ahead. Boone Keller had learned something valuable about second chances that they weren't given. They were earned through patience, sacrifice, and the kind of determination that refuses to accept defeat as permanent. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities, but tonight was perfect just as it was. A man, his horse, and the quiet satisfaction of a promise kept across 15 years of separation. Sometimes that was enough to justify any amount of sacrifice, any depth of struggle, any length of wait. Sometimes that was everything.